The door to the land office burst open with a force that rattled every window in the building, and Sheriff Nathan Ellsworth planted both boots on the threshold like a man who had walked through fire to get there and was not afraid of burning again. "Her signature was forged," Nathan said, his voice low and controlled in the way that a river is controlled right before it floods. "And I have the proof here." He set a folded document on the desk of Harlan Crew, the Sweetwater County land agent, and the sound of that paper landing was quieter than a whisper but louder than a gunshot in the silence that followed. Harlan Crew did not move. He was a compact man with oil-slicked hair and a smile that he wore the way other men wore holsters, always ready to draw it out when he needed cover. But right now, that smile was nowhere to be found. His eyes dropped to the document, then rose slowly back to Nathan's face, and something behind those eyes shifted, retreated, like a coyote that had just realized it had wandered into a trap set by something bigger than itself. "Sheriff," Harlan said carefully, "I don't know what you think you have there, but land transfers in this territory are legal documents witnessed and notarized by you," Nathan said. "Witnessed and notarized by you, which means you already know what I have, Harlan. You already know exactly what I'm going to prove." The room felt smaller suddenly, the afternoon sun pressing through the dirty glass of the office windows, throwing golden bars across the floorboards like the bars of a cage that was slowly closing around the man seated behind that desk. Nathan thought of Lucy Wallace. He thought of the way she had stood in the doorway of the farmhouse that was no longer legally hers, holding a letter from this very office, her hands absolutely steady even though her face had gone white as bleached linen. She had not cried. She had not screamed. She had simply looked at Nathan with those dark brown eyes that held more quiet courage than most men carried in their entire bodies, and she had said, "They took everything, Nathan. My father built that land with his own hands and they took every inch of it with a pen." That had been 4 days ago, and Nathan had not slept much since. He had ridden hard, asked harder questions, and followed a trail of paperwork and hidden motive that wound through 3 towns and back before it ended here, in this office, at this desk, with this man. The betrayal was not simple. Nothing about it was simple, but the proof was real, and Nathan was done letting real things be buried under comfortable lies. He pulled out the chair across from Harlan's desk, sat down, and said, "Let me tell you a story, Harlan, and then you are going to tell me yours. Because some stories only make sense when you start them from the very beginning, and the beginning of this one started 6 weeks ago, on a Tuesday morning in late October of 1882, when Lucy Wallace rode into Sweetwater Creek for the first time in 7 years. The town of Sweetwater Creek sat in the high desert country of Wyoming Territory, ringed by red rock bluffs that caught the last light of day and held it like a secret. It had grown since the railroad came through in 1879, grown in the way frontier towns always grew, quickly and without much plan, so that the buildings along Main Street had a crowded, leaning quality, as if they were all pressing forward to get a better look at whoever walked in. There was a hotel, a dry goods store, a saloon that changed its name with every new owner, a church that had been built by the Methodists and was now being contested by the Baptists, and the land office, which had been built by money that nobody talked about and that had survived every change of ownership and denomination, without once wavering in its purpose of making certain men richer and certain other people poorer. Lucy Wallace arrived on the Tuesday morning stage, stepping down onto the packed dirt street with a carpetbag in one hand and a leather satchel in the other, and she stood for a moment looking at the town with the expression of someone returning to a place that has changed so much it almost hid the shape of what it used to be. She was 26 years old, with dark brown hair pinned up under a practical hat, and a quality about her face that people often described as serious until she smiled, at which point they revised their assessment entirely. She had spent the last 7 years in St. Louis, first as a student at a small women's academy, then as a teacher at a school for children in the poorer districts near the river. She was educated, self-possessed, and entirely capable of handling herself, qualities that had been necessary in St. Louis, and that she suspected were going to be even more necessary now that she was back. Her father, Thomas Wallace, had sent for her 3 months ago. His letter had been brief in the way that men of his generation wrote letters, saying only that he was getting older, that the farm needed more hands than he could hire, and that he would be glad to see her. She had finished the school term, packed her belongings, and come home. Except when she arrived at the farm, 3 miles east of town on a stretch of good bottomland along Sweetwater Creek itself, she found the door locked with a padlock she did not recognize, and a notice nailed to the frame. The notice, printed on stiff paper with official-looking seals, informed any and all interested parties that the property known as the Wallace Farm, comprising 160 acres along the south bank of Sweetwater Creek, had been transferred by deed of sale to the Crew Land and Development Company, dated September 15, 1882, bearing the signature of one Lucy Wallace, current legal heir and holder of said property. Lucy stood on that porch for a long time, reading the notice 3 times, and then she stood there a little longer simply breathing, because breathing was the most useful thing she could do. She had signed no deed of sale. She had never been contacted about any deed of sale. She had been in St. Louis on September 15, 1882, teaching fractions to 9-year-olds. And her father, she would learn from a neighbor named Mrs. Abernathy, who came out to her gate with a face full of sorrow and a pot of coffee, had died quietly in his sleep on September 3rd, 2 weeks before the supposed date of the sale. The farm had passed to Lucy by the terms of his simple will, and someone had known that. Someone had known the exact shape of the inheritance and had moved fast and without mercy. Mrs. Abernathy told her that the doctor had confirmed a natural death, that Thomas Wallace had been failing for months, that the town had mourned him in the quiet way it mourned its old settlers, with a hymn and a short service and a plot on the hill. She told her that the new ownership had come as a shock, that people had assumed Lucy would come back and work the land, that nobody had quite believed it until the official papers were posted. Lucy had thanked Mrs. Abernathy for the coffee and the information, and then she had ridden back into town to find the sheriff. Nathan Ellsworth had been sheriff of Sweetwater Creek for 3 years. He had come to the territory from Colorado, where he had served as a deputy in a mining town so rough that Sweetwater Creek, by comparison, felt like a church social. He was 32 years old, broad-shouldered without being heavy, with light gray eyes and brown hair that needed cutting, and a quality of stillness about him that people who did not know him sometimes mistook for slowness until they saw him move. He was not slow. He was simply a man who understood the difference between motion and action, between talking and meaning something. He was fixing the latch on the door of the jail when Lucy walked up the street toward him, and he noticed her the way he noticed everything, completely and without apparent effort, taking in the carpetbag and the satchel and the set of her jaw and the paper she was holding in her hand before she had said a single word. "You would be the sheriff," she said. "Nathan Ellsworth," he said, "and you look like someone who needs to tell me something." Something in his directness loosened what she had been holding tightly since the porch, not quite enough to undo it entirely, but enough that she breathed more deeply and said, "My name is Lucy Wallace. My father's farm has been stolen, and I believe the paperwork used to steal it has my forged signature on it." Nathan had set down his tools and given her his complete attention, and she would remember later that this was the first moment she had been truly certain she had come to the right person. He had listened to everything she said without interrupting. He had asked 3 precise questions when she finished. Then he had said, "I'm going to need to look at that notice and whatever documents you have, and I'm going to need you to tell me everywhere you were between September 1st and October 1st that someone could verify." "I have a return train ticket with the date stamped," she said. "I have letters from my colleague dated through September. I have a receipt from a St. Louis boarding house dated September 17th. "Good," he said. "That's very good." And there was something in the way he said it, a quiet approval that was entirely professional and yet managed to be personally warm at the same time, that made Lucy realize she had been afraid in some hidden part of herself that no one would believe her. He believed her. She could see it clearly. And that mattered more than she had expected it to. She stayed at the hotel while Nathan began what she would later come to understand was an extraordinary amount of work compressed into a very short time. He was not the kind of man who did things halfway. He was not the kind of man who filed a report and waited. He rode out to see the farm himself that first evening, noting the padlock and the new notice and the fresh tracks around the property. He rode to see Mrs. Abernathy, and then he rode to see 2 other neighbors. He went through the land office records, which Harlan Crew provided with elaborate courtesy and a smile that Nathan noted carefully, and he looked at the deed of sale in its entirety, reading every line. The signature on the deed read Lucy A. Wallace in a hand that was close enough to convincing if you had never seen Lucy Wallace's actual handwriting. But Nathan had asked Lucy to write her name on a piece of paper that first afternoon, and he had the 2 side by side now, and the differences were small but they were there. The real signature had a particular flourish on the capital W, an upward sweep that the forged version had flattened. The letter Y in Lucy had a distinctive tail. These were the kinds of things that required careful looking, but they were there. He sent a telegraph message to St. Louis, to the school where Lucy had worked, requesting a formal written confirmation of her presence there through September. He sent another to the hotel in St. Louis she had mentioned. Then he started thinking about who in Sweetwater Creek would know enough about the Wallace property, the inheritance laws of Wyoming Territory, and the workings of the land office to put this scheme together, and who would have a strong enough reason to want that particular piece of bottomland. The answer to the last part came easily enough. Sweetwater Creek bottomland was some of the most productive acreage in the county, fed by genuine water in a landscape where water was the scarcest, and therefore the most valuable thing there was. Thomas Wallace had been farming it for 23 years. The creek that ran along the southern boundary had never dried up, not even in the drought years of 1877. Anyone with plans for cattle or agriculture on a significant scale would want that land very badly. The Crew Land and Development Company was the name on the deed. And Harlan Crew had been operating his land office in Sweetwater Creek for 4 years, always somewhere in the background of the county's most significant property transactions, always walking away a little richer and a little more powerful. Nathan began to build his case the way you build anything in difficult country, one solid piece at a time, testing each piece before you put weight on it. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, in the evenings when the town settled into its nighttime rhythms, and the stars came out enormous over the Wyoming dark, Nathan found himself thinking about Lucy Wallace in ways that went beyond the professional, and then catching himself and redirecting his thoughts firmly back to the professional, because this woman had come to him for help, and he was not the kind of man who confused his duties with his feelings. But the feelings were there. He could not pretend they were not. She was unlike anyone he had encountered in 3 years of Sweetwater Creek, which was not a town short on interesting people, but which was perhaps short on people with Lucy's particular combination of qualities. She was brave without being reckless. She was intelligent without using it as a weapon. She was angry, genuinely and righteously angry about what had been done to her and to her father's legacy, and yet she channeled that anger into precision rather than noise. She asked good questions. She offered observations that were useful. She was not sitting in the hotel waiting for someone to rescue her. She was actively engaged in her own rescue while also making clear that she trusted him to do his part. They met every afternoon in the small office behind the sheriff's station, Lucy with her documents and her careful memory, Nathan with his notes and his questions, and the work was genuine work, serious and focused, but it was also, undeniably, the best part of each day. On the third day, Lucy looked up from the papers they were reviewing and said, "You've been a sheriff for a long time." 3 years here, he said, 4 before that as a deputy. What made you want to do it? He considered the question. I don't know that I wanted to exactly. I think I was good at it and I thought the world needed more people doing things they were good at honestly. He paused. That sounds simpler than it is. No, she said. I understand exactly what you mean. I became a teacher for the same reason. I was good at explaining things and I believe that children deserve someone who is genuinely trying. They looked at each other for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then both of them looked back at the papers. You were in St. Louis for 7 years, he said after a moment, keeping his voice even. My father sent me there after my mother died. He thought the East would give me opportunities that the Territory couldn't. She paused. He wasn't wrong exactly, but he was also lonely, I think. He was always saying I should come back, and I was always saying there was one more year, one more class, one more cohort of children to see through the year. You feel guilty, Nathan said. Lucy was quiet for a moment. I feel like I spent my energy giving to other people's children when I should have given some of it to him. She said it steadily, but something underneath the steadiness moved, and Nathan recognized the shape of it, the particular grief of a person who had been responsible and sensible and correct, and who had lost something anyway. Your father was proud of you, Nathan said. Every neighbor I've spoken to said so. She looked at him. You asked about that. I ask about everything, he said, but the warmth in his voice when he said it was something he had not quite meant to put there, and they both heard it, and neither of them said anything about it. He received the telegraph responses on the 4th day. The school in St. Louis confirmed that Lucy Wallace had been present and employed through the end of September. The hotel confirmed her stay. Nathan also received a response from a contact in Cheyenne, a former colleague from his Colorado days who now worked for the Territorial Land Office, who told him something interesting. Harlan Crew had been investigated, though never charged, in connection with a suspicious land transfer in Carbon County 3 years ago. The case had dissolved when the key witness recanted, under circumstances that Nathan's contact described as unclear but troubling. Nathan added this to his file and kept building. What he needed was the original document that had been used to practice the forgery, or a witness who could speak to the mechanics of how the signature had been produced, or something that tied Harlan Crew directly to the production of the forged deed rather than simply to its filing and certification. He found it on the 4th evening, and it came from an unexpected direction. A young man named Eli Beecham, who worked as a clerk at the dry goods store, and who had the kind of face that was either entirely honest or entirely skilled at appearing so, came to Nathan's office after dark and knocked 3 times before pushing the door open. He was 19 years old and visibly frightened, which Nathan found more credible than the alternative. Eli had worked briefly for Harlan Crew the previous summer, doing filing and copying work. He had been there when Harlan received a letter from an Eastern bank about the Wallace property, and he had been there when Harlan had asked a man named Dix, who came and went from the land office without any official title, to look at a sample of handwriting and produce something similar. Eli had not understood at the time what was being produced. He understood it now that people were talking about it, and it was keeping him awake, and he had come to Nathan because Nathan had a reputation for being fair, and because Eli was scared of what happened to people who knew things and said nothing. Nathan took a careful, detailed statement from Eli Beecham and made him sign it in the presence of Nathan's deputy, a solid man named Pete Garrison, who served as witness. He asked Eli where Dix, the forger, could be found, and Eli said he thought Dix had moved on to Laramie, but that he had seen him in the saloon 2 nights ago, which meant he might still be within reach. Nathan sent Pete Garrison to the saloon, with a description and instructions to find out quietly whether Dix was still in the area. He was not. Pete came back with the information that a man matching the description had been seen leaving town that morning on the eastbound road. Nathan sent a telegraph to the sheriff in Laramie, giving the description and asking them to detain the man for questioning if found. He was building a wall, one stone at a time, and now he had enough stones to make the confrontation worth having. He told Lucy the next morning. She was sitting at the small table in his office when he came in with the documents organized in the order he would need them, and he told her what he had, what Eli had said, what the telegraph responses confirmed, what the comparison of the signatures showed and how he intended to show it. He laid it out clearly and completely, the way he would lay it out for any victim of a crime, and he watched her face as she processed it. She was very still for a moment when he finished. Then she said, "He knew my father was dying and he moved before I could even get here." "Yes," Nathan said. "He forged my name to steal land my father spent his life building." "Yes." "And he was going to get away with it." "He was going to try," Nathan said. "He is not going to succeed." Lucy looked at him for a long moment and something in her eyes changed, or rather something that had been there, carefully contained, became visible. It was not gratitude exactly, though gratitude was part of it. It was something deeper, the look of a person recognizing someone else not just as useful but as genuinely trustworthy, which is a rarer thing and a more significant one. "What happens now?" she said. "Now we go to the land office," Nathan said. "Together." He had not intended the word together to carry the weight it suddenly seemed to, but there it was. They walked up Main Street side by side in the mid-morning of a clear Wyoming day, the high desert light making everything sharp and shadowless, and people noticed. People always noticed when Nathan Ellsworth walked somewhere with purpose. The set of his shoulders and the particular quality of his stride communicated something that most of Sweetwater Creek had learned to read, which was that the sheriff was moving toward a reckoning, and it would be worth paying attention. Lucy walked beside him with her own kind of gravity, her chin level, her carpetbag swapped today for the leather satchel, her dark eyes steady on the door of the land office ahead. She was not performing courage. She simply had it, the way some people have good eyesight, as a native quality rather than an achievement. They pushed through the door of the land office together and the bell above it rang, and Harlan Crew looked up from his desk with the elaborate ease of a man who has prepared for visitors he was not expecting. "Sheriff," Harlan said, "and Miss Wallace, what a pleasant surprise." "Sit down, Harlan," Nathan said. Something in Nathan's tone wiped the pleasantness from Harlan's expression as efficiently as a cloth across a chalkboard. He sat. Nathan placed the documents on the desk, one by one in order. "This is the deed of sale bearing the forged signature," Nathan said. "This is a genuine sample of Lucy Wallace's handwriting, signed in front of 2 witnesses 4 days ago. Anyone with a magnifying glass and honest eyes can see the differences, but I have had a written analysis prepared by a handwriting expert in Cheyenne, whose opinion I have right here." Harlan opened his mouth. "I'm not finished," Nathan said. "This is a signed and witnessed statement from Eli Beecham, who was employed in your office during the period in question, describing in specific detail a meeting in which you arranged for the production of a handwriting forgery. This is a telegraph confirmation from the school in St. Louis where Lucy Wallace was employed on the date the deed claims she was present in Sweetwater Creek to sign it. This is a confirmation from her hotel in St. Louis for the same period. And this," he set the last document down, "is a letter from the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne noting your previous involvement in a suspicious transfer in Carbon County 3 years ago." The room was very quiet. Harlan Crew looked at the document spread before him. He looked at Nathan. He looked at Lucy, who was standing slightly to Nathan's left with her hands folded in front of her, watching him with an expression of complete and devastating calm. "I want a lawyer," Harlan said. "You can have one," Nathan said. "I'll be happy to allow you to send for one while you wait in my jail, But before we do any of that, I want to give you an opportunity to do the only thing that is going to make any difference for you at this point, which is to tell me the whole truth about who else was involved in this scheme, because a man as careful as you doesn't operate alone." Harlan was quiet for a long time. Outside, a wagon creaked past on the street. A dog barked somewhere distant. The land of Wyoming Territory lay enormous and unimpressed in every direction. "Beaumont," Harlan said finally. "Douglas Beaumont. He's the one who wanted the land. I filed the papers and handled the legal mechanics. He paid for it. He paid very well." Nathan nodded. He was not surprised. Douglas Beaumont was a cattle baron who had been assembling a land empire in the county for the past 2 years, always through the land office, always through Harlan Crew, always just inside the law or just outside it in ways that were difficult to prove. Nathan had his suspicions. Now he had more than suspicions. "You'll put that in writing," Nathan said. "Everything. Including Beaumont's role and what he paid you and how the arrangement was made. And if I do, then a judge will consider your cooperation when your case comes to trial. I can't promise you anything more than that, and I won't." Harlan looked at the documents again. He was a man doing arithmetic, adding up consequences, and the total was not good. "All right," he said. It took 2 hours to get the full written statement, with Nathan asking precise questions and Lucy sitting quietly in the corner, present as a witness, and as the person whose stolen property was at the center of everything. Nathan noticed that Harlan had a difficult time looking at her, which he interpreted correctly as the discomfort of a man who had thought of her as an abstraction, a name on a paper, a legal obstacle to be removed, and now found himself confronted with the actual human being he had wronged. Good, Nathan thought. Let him be uncomfortable. When the statement was signed and witnessed by Pete Garrison, who Nathan had telegraphed to come to the land office at a particular time, Nathan placed Harlan Crew under arrest and walked him down the street to the jail while Pete handled the paperwork and Lucy remained in the land office. Because the deed was now evidence, and Nathan intended to see that it was preserved exactly as it was. He came back to find her standing by the window, looking out at the street, and when she heard him come in she turned, and some of the composure she had held so perfectly for 2 hours finally cracked, just at the edges, just enough. "It's over," she said. "Or is it just beginning?" "The hard part is beginning," he said honestly. "There's still Beaumont, and there will be a trial, and you'll need to give testimony, and there will be some weeks before the land office issues a corrected deed and the property is formally returned to you. But the foundation is solid. The proof is real and it's documented. You're going to get your father's land back, Lucy." She was quiet for a moment looking at him, and then she said, "Thank you." 2 words. She did not elaborate, and she did not need to. The weight she put into them was everything. He almost said something then, something that had been accumulating in him for 4 days of mornings and afternoons, and that particular quietness between them when they finished the day's work, and had a moment that was not work. He almost said it, and then he remembered that her father had just died and her land had just been stolen, and she had been through an enormous amount of upheaval, and that this was not the moment, and that there would be a better one if he was patient. He was very good at patience. It was one of his most useful qualities, and sometimes one of the most inconvenient. The weeks that followed were the most unusual of Nathan Ellsworth's professional life, and the most unusual, in a different way, of Lucy Wallace's. She stayed in Sweetwater Creek. She had planned to. The farm was technically still hers in the eyes of the law since the deed was now under challenge, and she was not going to leave it uncontested. The hotel was adequate, and Mrs. Beaumont at the front desk was kind to her, which she found briefly ironic given the name, and then learned was a different Beaumont entirely. A coincidence of the West where families were scattered and names repeated. Nathan had the padlock removed from the farmhouse, which was within his authority given the challenged status of the deed, and Lucy moved into her father's house for the first time in 7 years. It was both harder and easier than she expected. Harder because every room held her father in it, his pipe on the mantel, his boots by the door, his handwriting on the almanac pages he had marked through years of careful farming. Easier because the house itself was solid and well built, and being in it felt like being held by something that did not waver, which was what she needed. She began cleaning and organizing, because doing nothing was not possible for her. She found her father's journals, 3 of them in a wooden box under his bed, and she read them over several evenings with a candle burning on the table, learning her father's last years in his own careful, unpracticed hand. He had watched her departure for St. Louis with a grief he had never expressed to her. He had watched the farm seasons with deep attention. He had noted in the last year that his health was failing, but had decided to simply be practical about it rather than alarmed. He had written her name frequently. He had believed she would come home. She had come home, only too late and to a locked door. Nathan came by the farm on the 3rd evening she was there, officially to update her on the status of the Crew case and the warrant that had been issued for Douglas Beaumont. Beaumont, it turned out, had gotten wind of Harlan's arrest with impressive speed and had left the county. Nathan had sent information to the territorial marshals and expected Beaumont would be found within the month. But the official part of the visit lasted perhaps 20 minutes, and then they were sitting on the porch in the cooling evening, the creek audible below the bluffs, the first stars coming out, and talking in the way that had become natural between them, ranging and honest and free. "What will you do with it?" Nathan asked, meaning the farm. "Farm it," she said. "It's good land. My father knew it was good land. I'm not going to let it sit and I'm not going to sell it. I'm going to learn to farm it. You don't know how. I know the basics. I grew up here until I was 19. I remember enough to start." She paused. "I'll need to hire some help. There's a neighbor, the Abernathy boy, who Mrs. Abernathy says is looking for steady work." "Young Tom Abernathy," Nathan said. "He's a good hand, hard worker. Do you know everyone in this county? Most of them, it's part of the job. Is coming out to check on crime victims also part of the job?" She said it with a sideways look that was perfectly calibrated between serious and not, and Nathan felt the warmth of it like something physical. "It's part of the job to follow up on open cases," he said, which was true, and they both knew it was not the whole truth, and the fact that they both knew it and neither of them said so directly was its own kind of conversation. He came back the following evening, and the evening after that. The Crew case was a legitimate reason, and then Beaumont's capture was a legitimate reason, and then the scheduling of the territorial hearing was a legitimate reason, and by the 4th week, Lucy had stopped reaching for reasons and simply set a second cup on the table when she heard hoofbeats on the road, because she had learned the particular rhythm of his horse. There was one evening in November, 2 weeks after Harlan Crew had been formally charged and held for trial, when they were sitting at the kitchen table with the hearing documents spread between them and the lamp burning warmly and the wind coming off the high desert outside with the first serious cold of the season, and Lucy said, "Tell me about Colorado." He had mentioned it in passing, his years there, and she had been curious ever since in the quiet way she was curious about most things, not noisily but persistently. He told her. He told her about the mining towns and the particular violence of places where men were desperate and far from home and full of whiskey, and how he had learned that being a lawman in such places was mostly about being a presence, about being the human evidence that not everything was lawless, that some things held. He told her about the partner he had lost in his 2nd year there, a deputy named Collins who had stepped in front of something meant for someone else and had not survived it, and how that had been the hardest thing he had carried. Lucy listened with the complete, focused attention that was one of the first things he had noticed about her, the way she listened as if what you were saying was genuinely the most important thing in the room. "What made you stay in law work after that?" she said. "Collins would have thought it was absurd to stop," he said. "He did what he did because he believed in the work. Stopping would have made his belief worth nothing." Lucy was quiet for a moment. "You honor the people you lose by continuing." "I try to." She looked at him steadily. "I understand that. I think that's why I'm going to farm this land instead of selling it. Not because it's the practical choice, though maybe it is, but because my father's 23 years of work should not just become somebody else's profit margin. Something moved across Nathan's face, something that was not quite a smile but held all the warmth of one. Your father would have liked you to know him as well as you do, he said. Lucy looked down at the table. I'm finding him in his journals. Better late than never, I suppose. They sat for a while in the comfortable silence that had developed between them. Not the silence of people with nothing to say, but the silence of people who have said enough for the moment, and are content to simply be in the same room. It was Nathan who moved first. He stood to go, as he always did at a reasonable hour, and reached for his hat, and Lucy stood too, as she always did, and walked him to the door as she always did. And in the doorway he turned, and they were close in the way that doorways make people close when they are not paying attention to the architecture, and he said, "Good night, Lucy," and she said, "Good night, Nathan," and neither of them moved for the span of several slow heartbeats. He touched her hand. Just that. His fingers over hers where she had her hand on the door frame, a light and careful touch that asked a question without words, and she turned her hand over and pressed her fingers against his, which was an answer. He looked at her. She looked at him. The cold Wyoming night was behind him, and the warm lamplight kitchen was behind her, and the doorway held them equally between the two. "I have been trying very hard," he said, "to be entirely professional." "I know," she said. "I noticed. It seemed important. You had a great deal to deal with." "It was considerate of you," she said, "but I think I've been dealing with it reasonably well." "You have been extraordinary," he said, and meant it with a completeness that was entirely sincere and not at all an exaggeration. Her fingers tightened slightly on his. "You have been the most genuinely good person I have encountered in a very long time," she said, "and I have met a great many people in 7 years." He lifted her hand and held it for a moment, just held it, and then he let go because he was still a man who understood timing, and he said good night again, and she said good night, and he walked to his horse and rode back to town under a sky full of stars. He was smiling for most of the ride back. He could not help it. The territorial hearing for the Crew case was scheduled for the first week of December, and before it happened, Douglas Beaumont was apprehended by the territorial marshals in Rawlins, 60 miles east. He was brought back to Sweetwater Creek under escort, and Nathan had the satisfaction of processing his arrest personally, which Beaumont received with the particular fury of a man who is accustomed to buying his way out of difficulties, and has just discovered the price has risen beyond his means. Beaumont's lawyers arrived from Cheyenne 3 days later, expensive and confident, and proceeded to make the case that their client had acted in good faith on information provided by the land agent, that the forged signature had been Harlan Crew's doing alone, and that Beaumont had no knowledge of any fraud. Nathan had Eli Beecham's statement and Harlan Crew's written confession naming Beaumont specifically, and the combination proved stronger than expensive lawyers, which was a thing Nathan found deeply satisfying. Lucy testified at the hearing with the same precision and composure she brought to everything, presenting her evidence, her timeline, her witnesses, her documents, in an order and with a clarity that left the presiding territorial judge no room for ambiguity. She was not dramatic. She was devastatingly factual, and factual was what was needed. The hearing resulted in a finding that the deed of sale was fraudulent, that Lucy Ann Wallace was the lawful owner of the Wallace farm, that the property was to be returned immediately, and that Harlan Crew and Douglas Beaumont were to face criminal charges in the territorial court in Cheyenne in the spring. When the judge announced the finding, Lucy did not visibly react in the hearing room. She simply nodded once in acknowledgement and said thank you quietly to the judge, and gathered her documents and walked out into the December cold of the street. Nathan followed her out. She was standing on the boardwalk, looking at the street, and he stood beside her and said nothing, and after a moment she turned and looked at him, and there were tears in her eyes, which was the first time he had seen tears there through all of it. "He gets the farm back," she said. "My father, he gets his land back, that's what I keep thinking, He gets it back even though he can't know it. Nathan put his arm around her without planning to, and she turned into him and put her face against his shoulder, and the tears she had been too precise and too practical to let fall through weeks of fighting now fell, quiet and brief, against his coat. He held her and looked out at the Wyoming sky, and thought that he had not been prepared for this, for any of it for her, and that this was the only time in his adult life when being unprepared had felt not like a deficit but like a gift. She pulled back after a moment, composing herself with the efficiency that was characteristic of her, and looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and the distance between their faces was the kind of distance that either stays where it is or closes, and both of them knew which it was going to be. He kissed her gently there on the boardwalk in the December cold of Main Street, Sweetwater Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1882, and she kissed him back with a warmth that surprised him and then did not surprise him at all, because nothing about Lucy Wallace was ever quite what you expected until it was exactly right. People saw. Of course people saw. It was a small town. By evening, Mrs. Abernathy and Mrs. Beaumont, who was not that Beaumont, and most of the Methodist congregation, were aware that the sheriff and the Wallace girl had been seen kissing in the street, and opinion was generally favorable, because Nathan Ellsworth was universally regarded as a good man, and Lucy Wallace had just fought for her father's land in front of a territorial judge, and won, which counted for a great deal in a community that understood the value of land and of fighting for what was right. They were careful after that, in the way of two people who are serious about something and do not want to rush it or treat it lightly. Nathan continued to come to the farm in the evenings, and now the visits had a different quality, the same honesty and the same ease, but also the new warmth of something acknowledged and growing. He brought her books, because he had noticed she loved to read, and the hotel had nothing worth reading, and the farm's library was her father's almanacs and journals. He brought her whatever came through the dry goods store that seemed interesting. He brought her a copy of a novel that had made its way out from the East, and she read it and reported back to him on it at length and with opinions, and he sat across the kitchen table from her and listened to her opinions and offered his own, and it was the best kind of argument, the kind where both people are genuinely engaged and neither is trying to win. She brought him coffee every morning when she came into town to check on the case developments and handle the paperwork of the property restoration, and they had developed a habit of 20 minutes at his office desk before the day's official business began, talking about everything except the case, because the case was always handled once business hours started, and these 20 minutes were theirs. He showed her the farm's creek boundary on a surveying map one afternoon, and in tracing the line with his finger he traced it over hers where she was holding the map, and she looked up from the map to his face, and he said, "I would like to call on you properly, Lucy, if you'd allow it." "I thought you already were," she said. "I want to be clear about my intentions," he said. "I'm not the kind of man who is vague about important things." She looked at him for a long moment with those dark eyes that held everything carefully and gave it out in measured portions. "Then let's be clear," she said. "What are your intentions?" "To court you," he said simply, "and to see where that goes, honestly and properly and with the seriousness it deserves." "Good," she said. And then she smiled, and there it was, the full version of it, the one that made serious into something entirely different, and Nathan thought that he was in significant trouble and was completely at peace with this fact. December settled into itself, cold and clear and high. Lucy hired young Tom Abernathy and began the work of preparing the farm for winter and planning for spring. She learned the inventory of what her father had kept, the tools and the equipment, and the animals he had maintained, and what the crew company's brief occupancy had taken or damaged. She found a neighbor 2 properties over, a widow named Clara Hennessy, who had been farming her own land alone for 8 years, and who became, within a week of Lucy's introduction, a source of practical wisdom and blunt advice that Lucy found more useful than most things. Clara Hennessy had opinions about Nathan Ellsworth. "He's a steady man," Clara said on their third visit, stirring the pot on her stove with the authority of someone who had stirred many pots and learned a great deal about life in the process. "Steady men are rarer than water in July. Don't be foolish about it." "I don't intend to be," Lucy said. "Good. Your father was a steady man too." The steady ones are sometimes hard to read because they don't do a lot of dramatics. But when they're in all the way. You'll never find him halfway on anything important. Lucy thought about this on the ride back to the farm and decided that Clara Hennessy was absolutely right, which was useful information to have, and also information she had already suspected was true. Nathan came for Sunday dinner in mid-December, which was a formal enough occasion that Lucy spent the better part of Saturday on it, not out of anxiety, but out of genuine enjoyment, because she had always found pleasure in doing things well. She made a proper roast, which required the kind of attention to the fire that her farm stove demanded, and biscuits, and an apple pie from the apples she had found in her father's root cellar, preserved through the fall. He brought her flowers, which in December in Wyoming Territory required genuine creativity, and what he brought was a cluster of dried wildflowers from the high meadow above town, the kind that kept their color when dried, yellows and russets and a particular shade of dusty purple, tied with twine. It was the most honest, practical, and thoughtful gift she had ever received, and she put it in a jar on the windowsill where it would catch the afternoon light. They ate at the table where she had been reviewing documents for weeks, which was now set with her mother's dishes that she had found wrapped carefully in the cupboard, and the quality of the meal and the setting and the company was such that it felt, in the best possible way, like something real and settled even though it was still new. After dinner he helped her clear the dishes, which she had not asked and would not have asked, and which he simply did, and she noticed how naturally he moved in her kitchen, not intruding but present, and thought that this was what Clara had meant about being in all the way. They sat by the fire afterward, not reviewing any documents, not discussing the case, simply sitting and talking about unrelated things, books and memories and the particular quality of Wyoming Territory winters compared to other winters they had each survived. And at some point the conversation trailed off into comfortable silence, and they sat in that silence for a long time, the fire burning, the wind outside, the creek audible faintly below. "I didn't think I would stay," Lucy said eventually. "I came back to deal with the farm and I thought perhaps I would sell it and go somewhere else, start fresh. And now," she looked at the fire, "now I can't imagine being anywhere else. Isn't that strange? 7 years away and 1 month back, and it's as if the leaving was just a long errand." "Not strange," Nathan said. "Some places are yours, some things are yours. When you get back to them you recognize them even if they've changed." She looked at him when he said that, and he was looking at the fire, not at her, but his profile in the firelight was the profile of a man who is exactly where he is supposed to be. "Yes," she said softly. "Exactly." The new year came in cold and quiet and full of promise. January in Wyoming Territory was the month when you did the interior work, the mending and the planning and the accounting of what the last year had been and what you intended the next one to become. Lucy Wallace found herself doing this both literally and in the larger sense. She mended fences, planned the spring planting schedule with Tom Abernathy, wrote letters to her former colleagues in St. Louis explaining that she would not be returning, organized her father's papers into a proper order and stored them with care. She also wrote in a journal, something she had not done since she was a girl, finding that the writing settled things that needed settling, made clear what was still unclear, and occasionally surprised her with what she found once she wrote it out. What she wrote about most often, she noticed, was Nathan. She wrote about the quality of his attention, which was the first thing she had noticed, the way he listened as if what you were saying mattered and was worth his full engagement. She wrote about his hands, which were large and careful and never fumbled. She wrote about the silences, which were never empty. She wrote about the dried wildflowers on her windowsill, and the fact that she replenished the water in the jar even though dried flowers do not need water, because she wanted to take care of the thing he had given her. She did not write about the future in any specific terms because she was a practical person, and the future was not yet present. But she was aware of it in the way you are aware of a large thing approaching from a great distance, not close enough yet to identify clearly but impossible to miss. Harlan Crew and Douglas Beaumont were tried in the territorial court in Cheyenne in March of 1883. Lucy traveled to Cheyenne to testify, and Nathan traveled with her, which was professionally appropriate since he was also a material witness and had handled the initial investigation. They rode the train together, 3 hours east across the territory, and sat in the railroad car watching the landscape change from the high red rock country of Sweetwater Creek to the flatter plains approaching Cheyenne. She had never traveled with anyone in this way. She had always traveled alone or in the company of strangers. The experience of traveling with someone who was comfortable alongside you, who handed you your coffee without fuss, and pointed out interesting things out the window and read beside you without requiring conversation, was new and pleasant in a way she had not expected. Cheyenne was larger than Sweetwater Creek by a factor of 10, with its capital status and its railroad hub and the particular energy of a city that was also still a frontier place. They stayed in separate hotels, which was proper, and met for meals and for the court sessions. The trial lasted 3 days. Harlan Crew had entered a guilty plea in exchange for a lesser sentence, having no remaining leverage and considerable incentive to cooperate. Douglas Beaumont contested everything, his lawyers performing an elaborate and expensive dance that ultimately accomplished very little because the evidence was simply too solid. Lucy testified on the second day. She was composed and clear and answered every question directly, including the ones that Beaumont's lawyers asked, in an effort to imply that she might have signed some document she did not remember, which she refused to concede because she had signed no such document, and she was not going to pretend otherwise for anyone's convenience. Nathan watched her from the gallery during her testimony and thought that if he had not already been entirely certain about how he felt, this would have been the moment. The quality of her integrity in that room, facing down expensive lawyers in a formal court, was something you did not see every day and something you did not forget. Beaumont was convicted of land fraud and conspiracy and sentenced to 5 years in the territorial prison in Laramie. Harlan Crew received 2 years, reduced for cooperation. The deed of the Wallace farm was formally confirmed in Lucy's name by the territorial court, a redundancy given the earlier hearing but one that felt, she said on the train ride home, like the final click of a lock finally set right. She said it and looked out the window at the country going past, and Nathan watched her profile, and then she turned and caught him watching, and neither of them looked away. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "Just thinking." "About what?" He was quiet for a moment, considering his approach. He was a man who was not vague about important things, and he had said so, and this was an important thing. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the fact that the case is resolved, officially resolved, legally complete, closed." "Yes," she said, watching him carefully, "which means that the professional relationship, strictly speaking, is also concluded." "Strictly speaking," she agreed. "I've been waiting for that," he said, "for everything to be settled and finished before I said this." She waited. "I love you," he said. "I've known it for a while. I didn't say it while things were unsettled because you had enough to carry and I didn't want to add weight. But it's been there, and it's real, and I thought you should know." The train moved through the high plains country. Outside, the afternoon light was golden and enormous. Lucy looked at him for a long moment and then she said, "I know. You know. I have known for quite a while. I was also waiting, for the same reasons partly, and partly because saying it out loud makes it real in a different way, and I wanted to be certain before I made it real." "Are you certain?" "Nathan," she said, in the tone of a person addressing a very intelligent man who is being somewhat dense, I am the most organized, methodical, evidence-based person you have ever met. I do not reach certainty lightly, but when I reach it, I am certain." He laughed. It was a full laugh, warm and genuine, the laugh of someone surprised into joy, and it changed his face in a way that she had seen only glimpses of and had wanted to see more of, and she reached across and put her hand over his. "I love you too," she said, quietly and entirely and completely. They arrived back in Sweetwater Creek on a late March afternoon with the first warmth of spring in the air and the creek running high with snowmelt, and the town looked the same as it always had, except that everything in it had changed, because the way you look at places changes when the most important thing in your life is located there. Spring arrived in full in April, and Lucy planted. Tom Abernathy and his younger brother helped, and Clara Hennessy came over with advice and 2 of her own seed starts, and the fields began to look the way her father's journals described them looking in the April entries, green and promising and properly tended. Nathan came on Sunday afternoons, and on some evenings during the week, and they had reached a point of ease with each other that was one of the great pleasures of his life, the ease of 2 people who have seen each other through difficulty, and come out the other side still more interested in the other than when they started. He proposed in May, on a Sunday afternoon when they had walked down to the creek bank below the farm, because the creek bank was one of the most beautiful places in the county on a May afternoon, the water running clean over the smooth stones and the cottonwoods in new leaf along the banks and the whole world smelling of green and water. He did not make a ceremony of it. He was not a man given to ceremony for its own sake. He simply stopped walking and turned to face her and said, "I would very much like to marry you, Lucy, if you'll have me." She looked at him. The creek moved behind him, the cottonwoods moved. The sky was the deep clear blue of Wyoming in May. "Yes," she said, "I will." He put his hands on her face, gently, and kissed her, and she put her hands over his, and the cottonwoods moved in the breeze and the creek kept moving, and the whole world was very much in its right place. They were married in June, in the Methodist church that was no longer being contested by anyone, because the Methodist minister and the Baptist minister had come to an arrangement sometime in the spring involving a shared hymnal and a schedule, which was the kind of creative frontier theology that Nathan privately admired. The church was full. Sweetwater Creek turned out for its sheriff's wedding with genuine enthusiasm, because Nathan Ellsworth was liked and respected in a way that goes beyond the professional, the way a man is liked when he is good at his work and is also simply a good man. And Lucy Wallace had won the county's regard during the hearing and the trial and the months of farming and general demonstrating that she was exactly who she appeared to be. Clara Hennessy sat in the front pew and cried during the ceremony and denied it afterward with magnificent conviction. Mrs. Abernathy brought food enough for 3 times the number of people present, which meant there was plenty. Pete Garrison stood as Nathan's best man and made a short, sincere speech at the reception that made several people cry, including Nathan's deputy, which surprised everyone including Pete himself. Lucy wore a dress she had bought in Cheyenne during the trial trip, not knowing then exactly why she was buying it, but knowing it was right. A dark blue wool that was practical enough for the climate and lovely enough for what a marriage ceremony deserved. She wore her mother's locket at her throat. Nathan wore his good coat and a clean shirt, and had actually gotten his hair cut, which Lucy had noted with affection without mentioning it. They stood before the minister and made their promises in the clear June light coming through the church windows, and the promises felt exactly as serious and exactly as joyful as they were supposed to feel, and Lucy thought, in the moment of saying them, that her father would have approved of every word. The summer was the best one Nathan could remember. It was a summer of mornings at the farm and evenings at the farm, and a kind of domestic happiness that he had not sought out, but that settled around him like something that had always been waiting. Lucy was a harder worker than anyone he had ever known, and the farm responded to her attention the way good land responds to good hands, with increasing generosity. The harvest in August was better than the previous year had been, according to Tom Abernathy, who had known the Wallace farm all his life. Lucy was also funny in ways that continued to surprise him, privately funny, with a dry observational wit that came out most fully when they were alone, and that he found endlessly delightful. She made him laugh more than anyone had in years. He found things he had not known he needed. The domesticity, the shared meals, the evenings reading or talking or sitting in the comfortable silence. The having of a person who was entirely yours and whom you were entirely. He had been good at being alone. He was better at being with her. She found her father in the farm's rhythms, and she found herself in the farming, which she had not expected, having thought of herself primarily as a teacher and a scholar. But the practical work of the land was satisfying in its directness, in the way it required your full attention and gave you back visible results, and she was good at it. She was good at most things she decided to be good at. In September, she told Nathan she was pregnant. He had been sitting at the kitchen table reading one of the books he had brought her, which he had borrowed back on the grounds that she had already read it. She came in from the garden and sat down across from him and said, "I have something to tell you." He put the book down and looked at her. "We're going to have a baby," she said. "In the spring, I think. Late spring." His face did something complicated and then settled into something simple and very complete, and he reached across the table and took both her hands. "Are you well?" was the first thing he said, which was the right first thing. "I feel very well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, but otherwise well." He was quiet for a moment, holding her hands, and then he said, "I am very happy, Lucy." "I know," she said. And she was, too, with a depth and a richness that she had not known was available to her. The autumn was beautiful, the red rock bluffs around Sweetwater Creek catching fire in the October light, the farm put to bed for winter with the satisfaction of work completed well, the root cellar full, the animals comfortable, the fence line sound. Lucy's pregnancy began to show, and the county, which had adopted the Ellsworths as a matter of communal pride, expressed its interest with food and advice and general goodwill that was sometimes overwhelming and always well-meant. Clara Hennessy was particularly pleased. "A baby on the Wallace farm," she said, as if this was the natural culmination of all previous events. "Your father would have been undone by it." "He would have been wonderful with a grandchild," Lucy agreed. "He was better with children than he knew how to say." "The steady ones usually are," Clara said, and glanced at Nathan, who was outside in the yard doing something with a fence post, and nodded with satisfaction. The winter was quiet and domestic, and Nathan found himself, in the long evenings, building things. He had always been somewhat handy and had never had particular occasion to apply this quality. Now he built a cradle, working on it in the evenings by the lamp, learning as he went, making it from good solid pine that would last. Lucy watched him work sometimes, reading in the chair near the fire, and the image of him bent over his careful work with the firelight on his face was one she stored away with the other important images. He finished the cradle in February and set it in the corner of the room they had prepared, and they both stood looking at it for a moment in the particular silence of people looking at the physical evidence of what is coming. He put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and he felt the life moving inside her with wonder, because it was wonderful. This entire chain of events that had begun with a locked farmhouse door, and a woman holding a piece of paper with fury in her eyes, and had arrived at this warm room and this cradle and this being held. The baby came in late May of 1884, in the farmhouse, with the creek running high with spring and the cottonwoods in new leaf, as if the world was producing its own celebration. The doctor from town came out, and Clara Hennessy came, and it was a long labor but not a difficult one, and what emerged was a boy, sturdy and loud and immediately furious with existence in the way of healthy infants. Nathan was there through all of it, or as much of it as was permitted. He sat in the kitchen with Clara, who informed him with authority that everything was going exactly as it should, and that he should have more coffee and calm down. He was not uncalm, precisely. He was very still, in the way he was still when something enormous was happening, his attention entirely elsewhere. And then the first sound of the baby's cry came through the wall, and Nathan put down his coffee cup very carefully and stood up and said, "That's him, isn't it?" Clara smiled. "That's him." Lucy was exhausted and luminous in the particular way of women who have just done something extraordinary, and she was holding the baby when Nathan came in and sat beside her on the bed and looked at the face of his son for the first time. The baby had dark hair from Lucy and gray eyes that Nathan suspected were from him, and the expression of a person who has opinions and will be expressing them shortly. "Thomas," Lucy said, "if you agree." "Thomas," Nathan said, "Thomas Wallace Ellsworth." "Yes." He kissed her temple and looked at his son, and understood that the word together that he had said on the morning they walked to the land office had been the beginning of a much larger thing than he had known how to imagine then. Thomas Wallace Ellsworth was a healthy and opinionated child who became, as he grew toward his first birthday, deeply interested in everything within his reach, and as he became mobile, this turned out to be a great deal. He had his father's steady quality and his mother's intense attention, and he was devoted to Clara Hennessy, who had appointed herself his unofficial grandmother with the authority of long frontier practice. Lucy returned to the farm work in the summer with Tom Abernathy's help, and found that farming with a baby was different from farming without one but not impossible, and that the farm itself seemed to have opinions about Thomas's presence in it, producing particularly well that year in a way that she allowed herself to think of as the land recognizing its heir. Nathan continued his work as sheriff. He was re-elected in the fall election of 1884 without opposition, because in 3 years of additional service, he had not given the county any reason to want someone different. He handled his work with the same precise care he always had, and he came home every evening to the farm, which was now unambiguously home in a way that no place had been since his childhood in Colorado. On a November evening, with Thomas asleep in the cradle that had become slightly small for him and would need to be addressed soon, Lucy looked up from the mending she was doing and said, "I had a letter from the school in St. Louis." "Oh, from my old colleague, Mrs. Randall. She's starting a new school and wants to know if I would consider coming back." Nathan was very still in the way he was still when things were important. "What did you write back?" Lucy smiled at her mending. "I thanked her very sincerely and told her that I am fully engaged in my current work, which is true, and that I have no plans to leave Wyoming Territory, which is also true." She paused. "I also told her that if she needs advice on curriculum, I would be happy to correspond. I miss the teaching sometimes." "There are children in this county who could use a teacher," Nathan said carefully. "There is a school," Lucy said. "Miss Peterson's school. It's adequate." "Miss Peterson is leaving in the spring," Nathan said, "to be married. I heard it from Pete, who heard it from Mrs. Peterson, who is apparently planning the wedding with considerable energy." Lucy looked up from her mending. "How long have you known that?" "2 weeks," he said. "I was waiting to see if you mentioned the St. Louis letter first." She looked at him with the expression he had come to know as delighted exasperation. "You are a patient and slightly devious man, Nathan Ellsworth." "I learned from the best," he said. She thought about it through the winter, and talked it over with Nathan through multiple evenings and multiple cups of coffee, weighing the farm and Thomas and the amount of time it would require against the pull of teaching, which she felt as genuinely physical, a drawn toward feeling she could not dismiss. She talked to Clara, who told her that plenty of women had managed to do more than one thing, and that she should stop worrying about being too ambitious because ambition on the frontier was the same as survival and should be celebrated. In the spring of 1885, Lucy Ellsworth accepted the position of teacher at the Sweetwater Creek School, where she taught 23 children in a single room with the intensity and precision and genuine care that had characterized her work in St. Louis, except that here the children were hers, in the county sense, and some of them came in on horses, and some of them had chores that made them late in planting season, and she accommodated all of it because she understood the life. Thomas, now nearly a year old and pulling himself upright on every available surface, came to school with her on the days when Tom Abernathy was not available to watch him at the farm, and the older students fought quietly for the privilege of holding him during lessons. The years of 1885 and 1886 were the years when everything became what it was going to be, and they were good years, genuinely and abundantly good in a way that both Nathan and Lucy recognized and were careful not to take for granted. The trial's resolution had removed the last shadow from the property. The farm prospered. The school flourished. The county grew in the way Wyoming Territory was growing, carefully and not always justly, but with people of good faith working within it doing their best to make it better. Nathan dealt with the usual work of frontier law, disputes over water rights and cattle, and the occasional matter of someone making poor decisions with whiskey. He dealt with it with patience and fairness and the particular authority of a man who has never needed to raise his voice to be taken seriously. He brought home a stray dog in the fall of 1885, a brown cattle dog with one ear that stood up and one that didn't, who Tom Abernathy had found on the road and named Biscuit before anyone else had a chance to weigh in. Biscuit became devoted to Thomas with the specific loyalty of working dogs, and they were inseparable from Thomas's second year onward. Lucy continued to find her father in the farm and in the land, in the particular quality of the light on the creek in the mornings, and in the way good soil felt in her hands, and in the almanac pages she still kept because his handwriting was there. She wrote in her own journals with regularity, and she wrote letters to her former colleagues, and to Mrs. Randall in St. Louis with the frequency and warmth of a person who has roots in one place and genuine affection for the people she has known in others. She wrote about Thomas and his emerging personality, which showed signs of combining her intensity with Nathan's steadiness in ways that were already occasionally formidable for a 2-year-old. She wrote about Nathan with the privacy and the depth that she reserved for the things that mattered most, not performing happiness but recording what was real. What was real was that they had built something between them that was not luck, though luck had played a part, and not fate, though she was occasionally willing to consider the possibility. It was built of choices, daily and deliberate, of showing up fully to the life they had made and to each other. It was built of honesty and trust, and the particular intimacy of two people who have seen each other frightened and certain and uncertain and laughing, and moved by ordinary things and extraordinary ones. It was built of a forged signature and a locked farmhouse door and a sheriff who believed her immediately and acted on it, and of 4 days of working side by side on something that mattered, and of a doorway in November with cold on one side and warmth on the other and both of them exactly between. In the autumn of 1886, Lucy told Nathan she was pregnant again. He was outside checking on a fence line when she came and stood at the edge of the yard and called his name, and when he came to her, he saw the look on her face, which was the look of someone who is holding something wonderful and is about to give it to you. "Again," he said. "Again," she said. He lifted her off the ground for a moment, which was not a thing he generally did, because he was not a man who did large gestures, but this felt like the occasion, and she laughed the full open laugh that was rare and precious and his favorite sound, and Biscuit came running over to see what the excitement was about. The second baby was born in May of 1887, on another warm late spring day with the creek running and the cottonwoods leafed out, because May seemed to have become the month their family grew. It was another boy, as loud and opinionated as his brother had been, with Nathan's coloring this time, brown-haired and gray-eyed, and Thomas, now 3 years old and possessed of full working opinions, was deeply interested in him. "James," Nathan said when Lucy asked, "after Collins, if you agree." She agreed without hesitation. James Collins Ellsworth, a name that carried something of what they both believed about honoring those who came before and those whose choices made other choices possible. Thomas regarded James with a mixture of intense curiosity and the territorial wariness of a firstborn. And then Biscuit went and lay down beside the cradle, and Thomas decided that if Biscuit approved, he did too, which was a precedent that would serve the family well for many years. Life settled into the rhythms of a family with 2 small children and a farm and a school and a sheriff's office, which is to say that it was never exactly quiet and rarely dull, and contained within it an enormous amount of ordinary happiness. The kind that doesn't announce itself or perform itself, but that is there in the morning coffee and the evening return and the particular pleasure of a Sunday afternoon with nowhere you have to be. Nathan added a room to the farmhouse in the summer of 1887 to accommodate the growing family, and did a significant portion of the work himself with Tom Abernathy's help. Lucy taught him during this process that she had opinions about windows, specifically that there should be more of them and larger ones, and he built the addition with 4 windows facing east and south that let in the morning light and the afternoon light in a way that made the room feel twice its actual size. She put the dried wildflower jar on the windowsill of the new room, replenished from the high meadow every autumn, because it had been on every windowsill she had occupied since Nathan brought it, and she intended to keep it there. The school year of 1887 to 1888 was Lucy's 3rd, and by this point the school had more students than it had started with, because the county was growing, and because parents who had seen what their children were learning under Lucy Ellsworth talked about it in the way that parents talk about things that matter, which is to say frequently and with conviction. The territorial superintendent of schools visited in October and told Lucy that Sweetwater Creek School was among the best performing in the territory, which was gratifying to hear and more gratifying to believe was genuinely true. She told Nathan that evening, and he said, "I'm not surprised," with a quietness that was entirely sincere and not at all a small thing. "You're never surprised by anything good I do," she said. "I told you at the beginning," he said. "I knew immediately what kind of person you were. I've just been watching it be proved right ever since." She looked at him across the kitchen table where they had sat so many hundreds of times now, this table that had been her father's and was now theirs, and felt the full depth of what they had built and what they were and what they would continue to be, and said, "I love you, Nathan, very much." "I know," he said, which was exactly what she had said to him on the train from Cheyenne in March of 1883, and they both knew it and both of them smiled. Thomas and James grew in the way of children with good land and good parents, and a steady dog and room to run, which is to say they grew strongly and with character. Thomas had Lucy's precision and Nathan's patience, and an affinity for animals that pleased Tom Abernathy greatly, because Tom had always thought the Wallace farm would have been better for more livestock. James had Nathan's stillness and Lucy's wit, and the particular quality of a youngest child who has learned to observe carefully before acting, which served him well. In the years that followed, the Ellsworth farm and the Ellsworth family became one of those fixed points in a community that people orient themselves by without quite knowing they're doing it. The kind of family that is simply there, reliably and well, and that makes the community stronger by being part of it. Nathan continued as sheriff through the end of the decade and into the 1890s, re-elected each time by a county that trusted him because he had earned it. He handled the slow change of the territory into statehood in 1890 with the same measured attention he brought to everything, watching Wyoming become the 44th state, and the first to grant women full voting rights with a quiet satisfaction that Lucy said was the most personally gratified she had ever seen him. Lucy taught until Thomas was old enough for school, and then had to manage the somewhat complex situation of teaching her own eldest child, which she navigated with the precision and fairness that characterized her general approach to complicated things. Thomas was a good student and was reasonably well behaved, though there was one incident involving a frog and the schoolroom's water pail that Nathan heard about at dinner, with a face of complete neutrality that did not entirely disguise his amusement. Harlan Crew served his 2 years in the territorial prison and left Wyoming upon his release without ceremony or forwarding address. Douglas Beaumont served 4 of his 5 years and was released in 1887, but made no attempt to return to Sweetwater Creek, his cattle empire having dissolved in his absence into debts and litigation. The Wallace farm continued. The creek continued. The cottonwoods continued. The dried wildflowers were replenished each autumn. On a particular September evening in 1891, when Thomas was 7 and James was 4, and the harvest was in, and the root cellar was full, and the school year had just begun, and the Wyoming sky was doing the extraordinary thing it did in September, where it seemed to hold both the last of summer and the first of autumn simultaneously. Nathan and Lucy sat on the porch of the farmhouse that had been locked with a padlock 9 years ago, and that was now so thoroughly theirs that the padlock might as well have been in another lifetime. The boys were inside, audibly settling toward sleep. Biscuit was on the porch steps, his one upright ear and one downright ear arranged in perfect canine contentment. The creek was audible below, moving in its continuous way. The stars were beginning to come out, enormous and familiar. "I want to tell you something," Lucy said. "Tell me." "When I came back to find this farm locked and a notice on the door with my forged signature on it, I thought the worst thing that had ever happened to me had happened. And it was a terrible thing. It was a cruel and deliberate act of betrayal, and it was meant to erase my father's life's work and send me away with nothing." She paused. "But the thing that came from it was you, and everything we have made from that. And I don't know how to reconcile those two facts exactly, except to say that I am grateful for both of them, for what I lost that made me fight and for what I found in fighting for it." Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I thought about that too, that the worst thing that happened to you is also why we have everything we have. Yes, I think," he said slowly, "that the best you can do with something like that is exactly what you've done. Make something real and lasting from it. Honor what was taken by building something that lasts." She leaned her head against his shoulder, in the way she had leaned against him 1,000 times now, the easy and absolute familiarity of it. "We have done that," she said. "We have," he agreed. The stars came out in full, the way Wyoming stars came out, all at once and more than you ever expected, filling the sky from horizon to horizon with the accumulated light of everything that was far away and still shining. The farm was there, and the creek was there, and the children were there, settling into sleep in rooms with large eastern windows, and the dog was on the steps, and the dried wildflowers were on the windowsill inside, and Nathan Ellsworth and Lucy Wallace Ellsworth were on the porch of the house that her father built and that she had fought for and won, sitting together in the kind of silence that is not empty at all but full, entirely full, of everything that matters. It had begun with a forged signature and a hidden motive and a crime that had seemed, for a moment, absolute. It had become this. Love that was not accidental and not fragile. A life built deliberately on solid ground, by two people who had recognized each other immediately and chosen each other freely and gone on choosing each other every morning after that. In the creek below the bluffs, the water moved. In the sky above, the stars held their light across impossible distances, and on the porch of the Wallace farm, everything was exactly as it was supposed to be.